Hi Year 10, back again for another tutorial. This week we're looking at Macbeth Act 3 Scene 2. It's quite a short scene, really important one though, and is one of those high probability scenes that you are very likely to get an extract from in the exam. So this is well worth going through quite carefully. Okay, so as usual, if you haven't already done so, make sure you've read through the scene before you watch the rest of the tutorial, and definitely before you try and attempt the response task at the end. So everything from this point will assume that you've done that and that you understand what's going on. Okay, so what happens in the scene? So the scene is set in the palace at Forres, where we saw Macbeth and Banquo talking last week. And this is a little bit later on in the afternoon of the coronation feast. So Macbeth is thinking about that feast in the evening, and this is a little bit later on. And we can assume that this is happening after he's had his meeting with the murderers. If you remember last week, Macbeth said that he would get back to them within the hour to tell them the details of the plan. So we can assume that this is after that has already happened. Lady Macbeth is who we start the scene with, and she's talking to an attendant at first, and then she's left alone. And in that moment where she's alone, she confides that she feels dissatisfied with her role as queen. So just like Macbeth last week, we hear that even though Lady Macbeth appears to have been given all that she ever wanted, she isn't happy. She sends her servant off to call for Macbeth, and when he arrives, she tries to comfort him, and she encourages him again to put all the events that have happened recently behind him and stop thinking about them. And he says that he's unable to do that because he feels that they're still in danger. There are still risks. I'm just going to move my face to the top. He implies that he would be better off dead than alive with the anguish that he's feeling. So we get a glimpse into the minds of both of the characters in this scene, and we see just quite how extreme Macbeth's emotional and mental turmoil is. And he tells Lady Macbeth to pay special attention to Banquo at the feast, to pretend that everything is fine. He says that they're going to have to use a bit of flattery to get through this dangerous period. And so he encourages her to do that. But we as the audience know that he has sent murderers to kill Banquo. And so we need to ask questions about why he encourages her to make nice with Banquo at the feast. And he also reveals that Banquo and Fleance are a torment to him. So he tells us a little bit more about what's causing him all the pain and anguish. He implies to Lady Macbeth that something terrible is going to happen before nightfall. And so that's a nod towards the murder that is happening elsewhere, even perhaps while this scene is taking place. And Lady Macbeth asks for more details, but Macbeth refuses to say any more. He says that it's so that she's innocent in this murder, but obviously she isn't innocent because she was complicit in the murder of Duncan. So there's something going on there as well. But what he does say is that she's going to be impressed when she finds out what's happened. She's going to be really impressed with what he's done. Okay, so at the end of the scene, he then calls night to come sooner. because he wants it all over with. He wants to feel secure. Perhaps he's thinking he'll get a good night's sleep if Banquo and Fleance are out of the way. So he wishes for night to come quickly so that it can all be over and the deed can be done. And he finishes the scene by saying that things that have started with evil deeds need more evil deeds to make them secure. And so he's pointing towards the events that happen in the rest of the play. So this is one of those pivotal scenes where the dynamic of the play and the sort of behaviour and function of the characters really starts to shift. So this is one of those really important scenes that is really key for everything that follows. This is almost the pivot point for the play where things tip against Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Okay, so let's get into our analysis. As we've said, the scene begins in the palace at Forres. So if you remember, Act 3, Scene 1 was outside the palace, and Act 3, Scene 2 is happening inside. So we're going deeper in to the building, but we're also going deeper into the minds of the characters here. So the setting seems to echo what's happening in the play. Now, the first thing that Lady Macbeth says, she's talking to a servant here, and the first thing that she says is Banquo gone from court? So her first question is about Banquo, and we've got to ask ourselves why she's thinking about Banquo. Could it be that she is having exactly the same thoughts as Macbeth? I think she is. I think we'll see later on that there are other clues that suggest that she is concerned about the prophecy about Banquo. Remember, Macbeth told her everything in his letter. So she knows about the prophecy about Banquo and Fleance, and she is probably feeling some of the same anxieties that Macbeth is feeling. So the servant confirms that Banquo has gone, but he's coming back for the feast. And Lady Macbeth sends the servant off to tell Macbeth that she wants to talk to him. So off the servant goes. And so we get a little moment, very brief moment, it's just this little speech where Lady Macbeth is on her own. And so we get a little mini soliloquy here that shows us what she's thinking. The first thing she says echoes what Macbeth has been talking about in the previous scene. So she says, naught's had, all spent, where our desire is got without content. And if you remember in the previous scene, Macbeth said, to be thus is nothing, but to be safely thus. And this is exactly the same thought. It's exactly the same sentiment. She's saying that it all means nothing. Everything they've done means nothing. Being queen means nothing if she's not happy and secure and safe in that role. And so what we see here is that both of the characters are thinking in exactly the same way. The problem is that they don't know that they both are. We as the audience do, but they don't. So she says that she would have been better off being murdered than being the murderer, because of the unsettled feelings that she has. And so again, we're going to see Macbeth echo this later in the scene, so it's important to hold that in mind. Now notice Lady Macbeth's language here. She's speaking in iambic pentameter, and so this helps these lines stand out. There are rhyming couplets and that make these lines stand out as being really important. So if you notice here, we've got a couplet that makes that line stand out because the rest of it isn't all rhymed. So where the rhyme falls, we really notice it. And look at the words that are linked. We've got destroy and joy, and they're almost complete opposites. So we've got this conflict going on in her emotions. She recognizes the destruction that she's brought, but it's cost her any sense of joy in the role that she now has. So in comes Macbeth, and look at how she greets him. Think about how we've seen her interact with him in the past, and look at what she's like now. She says, "How now, my lord? How are you?" And she's showing him a lot of respect. She calls him lord. Remember, he's king now, so she's showing him the respect he deserves. And she asks him, "Why do you keep alone?" Now, this is really interesting because she thinks that because Macbeth isn't with her, he must be on his own. She has no idea what we've seen in the previous scene. So we know that he's far from being alone. He's been having meetings with hired killers to sort out the murder of Banquo. He hasn't been on his own. She's completely in the dark about all of this, and it just highlights to us how secretively Macbeth is behaving at this point in the play. She recognises, though, that Macbeth can't shake the thoughts of the murder, and she says that he's almost making friends with those terrible memories that he has, and this shows concern for him. She's worried about his well-being, and this is a different side to Lady Macbeth that we haven't maybe seen before. And she repeats again her advice. If you remember, she advised Macbeth in quite a harsh way, actually, in Act 2, Scene 2, to not think about what he'd done. Do you remember? She says something like, "These deeds must not be thought of after these ways, else it will make us mad." So she gave him a word of caution back then, and she's repeating that now. She's saying that the thoughts about Duncan's death should have died with him, and Macbeth mustn't keep thinking about it. Now, we know, again, as the audience, that actually he's not really thinking about what he did to Duncan. What he's thinking about now is the lack of security of his reign as king, and she's thinking about the same thing. So while we see that they're thinking in similar ways, we also see that there's a misunderstanding creeping in. There's a disconnection creeping in between them. They're not understanding each other in the way that they did earlier in the play. And she makes this all sound quite glib and facile. I'll explain those words in a minute. She says, "Things without all remedy should be without regard. What's done is done." And there's this sort of proverbial tone. This sounds like one of those phrases that your grandma says, where, you know, it's like a turn of phrase, a figure of speech, an old-fashioned moral. That's what her language sounds like. And glib means it's light and chaffy. It's not really full of meaning and importance. And facile means it seems to, in a childish way, misunderstand the importance or significance of what Macbeth is experiencing. And that sort of light-hearted approach that she takes actually shows that she doesn't see Macbeth's troubles, his emotional turmoil, as being a really important or significant issue. And she sort of brushes it off with this really offhand, really light-hearted, "Oh, just put it out of your mind, don't worry, don't cry over spilt milk." It's that sort of feel. Now, Macbeth's response is full of almost gravitas. It's full of seriousness, and it shows that actually maybe he has got a stronger sense of what's going on than she has. So he uses a metaphor here that shows us that he knows that things aren't over. Do you remember Donald Bain in a couple of scenes ago said that there will be more murders to come? This isn't the first murder. This isn't the only murder. The murder of Duncan wasn't the end of it. He said that there will be more murders to come. And here, Macbeth seems to be pointing towards the other murders that Donald Bain foretold. And so he uses this metaphor of the snake. He says, we've scotched the snake, not killed it. We've burnt it. We haven't killed it completely. And he says, eventually, the wounds that the snake has experienced will heal and it will be back to full strength again. And so he's worried that if he leaves things too long, it will all come back to bite him. Now, think about the connotations of his imagery. We're going to see more like this later in the scene. His imagery is actually quite sinister and dark. So here we've got connotations of a venomous snake. It's dangerous, it's deadly, it's sly, but it's also camouflage. Snakes hide very well. Remember Lady Macbeth's metaphor from Act 1, Scene 5. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. So we've got that echo again of a snake being in hiding. And so Macbeth knows that even though the problems that have been created by murdering Duncan aren't necessarily obvious, they are nevertheless there and they're really dangerous. He reveals some of the effects he's suffering since the murder, and he mentions constant fear, eat our meal in fear. So this is fear during seemingly ordinary events in the day, things that you shouldn't be sitting eating dinner feeling frightened, and yet that's how he reveals he's feeling. But he also talks about terrible dreams that shake us nightly. He's having nightmares every night. And so do you remember he heard that voice during the murder of Duncan that said Macbeth will sleep no more? It seems like that voice was right. Macbeth is having trouble sleeping because every time he sleeps, he has a terrible nightmare that wakes him up. So this is some of the trauma that Macbeth is feeling, some of the mental torment or torture, and actually he uses the word torture himself. He echoes Lady Macbeth's words. So he says he would be better with the dead. It'd be better if he was dead. And he reflects on the fact that Duncan, even though he's dead, is now at peace. And he says he sleeps well, nothing can touch him further. It's almost like Macbeth envies Duncan's death because at least there's nothing tormenting him anymore. So that's quite revealing about what Macbeth's struggling with. He notice the irony in this line. He said that to gain their peace, they murdered Duncan. They sent Duncan to peace. But peace is the one thing that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth haven't gained through the murder of Duncan. And so it's almost like he knows how ironic this all is. He knows how they've cheated themselves through these lines. It's very, very telling about how Macbeth's feeling. Notice as well the pronouns that he uses. We, to gain our peace, have sent to peace. He includes Lady Macbeth and acknowledges that she is totally complicit. I wonder actually whether he blames her a little bit, that even though he was the one that actually took Duncan's life, Lady Macbeth was as much involved as he was. I wonder whether he blames her or not, whether he's trying to ease his own conscience by including her in the murder. Look at the semantic field as well here. Look at the number of words that Macbeth includes that are all about suffering and torment. We've got fear, affliction, terrible, shake, dead, torture, fitful fever, treason, worst, steal. This is to do with weapons, poison, malice, and levy. All of these words are all showing sort of chaos and torment and suffering. And so what we can see is that how Macbeth feels is pouring out into the language that he uses. These are the words that come to mind when he speaks. We are also seeing Macbeth reflecting on Duncan's reign, and he describes Duncan's life as a fitful fever. So this is him acknowledging that Duncan's reign wasn't easy, and he refers to the fact that there was lots of fighting, there were battles in Duncan's reign, steel meaning like weapons, daggers and swords. And he refers to the events of earlier on in the play, domestic malice. So this is a reference to MacDonald being a traitor, and foreign levy is the invasion from Swano, the King of Sweden. So this is pointing us back to the battle that the play began with. And it shows that Macbeth is reflecting a little bit on this. Duncan was a rightful king. He was a good king, and yet experienced all of this trouble during his reign. Now, if Duncan experienced that, what is going to be in store for Macbeth as his reign continues? If Duncan had a hard time, how much worse is it going to be for a usurper, somebody that is not rightfully the king? So Lady Macbeth comes back in at this point and she offers comfort, and she says, "Come on, gentle, my lord," and this sort of appeasing, comforting tone. And this is so different to what we've seen of her before. We've got to ask ourselves why she's so gentle here. And I'm going to suggest two possibilities, but neither of them are very good. So perhaps she's being genuine here. Perhaps she's genuinely comforting and being gentle, in which case all that fortitude, that sort of inner strength that she showed earlier in the play seems to have vanished. It seems to have gone. So if she's being genuine, then her inner strength has been broken. Perhaps she's being fake though. But if she's being false, then she's pushing down that turmoil that we saw her express in the very first words of this scene. All that fear and doubt and insecurity is being covered over and suppressed. Now, if that's the case, it's gonna blow at some point. It's gonna find release somewhere. So whether she's being genuine or fake, neither bodes very well for her future in this play. Something is going to snap in her at some point. So she encourages Macbeth again to conceal his feelings and pretend that everything's well. So she talks about him putting on a false face. Sleek are your rugged looks. Rugged looks talks about the frown, the concern that's showing on his face, and she's telling him to make his face smooth again, get rid of all the furrows in his brow. And she's encouraging him to be bright and happy at the feast, pretending like everything's fine. So again, this is her encouraging him to put on a good show, to be fake, to hide his true feelings. And Macbeth echoes this and agrees with her. He says that he will, and he echoes exactly the sentiment. He says, let's make our faces vizards. Vizards are masks to our hearts, disguising what they are. So he's basically saying that they've both got to make their faces hide what's really going on in their heart. And so this is all about them concealing and hiding, and reminds us that they're doing that with each other, whereas in the past they were open, they were fake with everybody else but open with each other. Now they're being fake with each other, and so there's nowhere that they can really express what they're really feeling. That's not going to go well. So what Shakespeare's doing here is highlighting how similar they are. So earlier in the play, we might have thought that Macbeth was this good guy and Lady Macbeth was a manipulative shrew that was making him do things that he doesn't really want to do. But actually, Shakespeare is showing us something different. They are both the same. They're both ambitious. They're both sneaky. They're both quite cruel. They're both fake. And he's drawing out that similarity because while they're both the same, they don't know they are. And so we've got another example of Shakespeare using dramatic irony. We as the audience can see what's really going on, but the characters can't. And so what that does to us is make us feel really anxious about what's going to happen in the future, because they're both suppressing their true feelings and pretending that everything's okay when it isn't. And that can't end well. So it starts building up that tension again that's going to grow through the rest of the play and come to a very bleak ending for both of them. So what's really significant at this point is that it's the first time where Macbeth deliberately deceives Lady Macbeth. He's been a little bit fake, he's concealed things, he's brushed over things, but he's not actually lied to her face before, but he does now. So she's mentioned the banquet, and Macbeth picks up on this, and he tells her to pay specific attention to Banquo at the feast and make nice with him. And he said that he says that one of the ways they're going to get through this difficult period is by flattering people that they need on their side. And so he encourages her to do that. But we know that somewhere else, two murderers have gone to kill Banquo, and we know that Macbeth has initiated that. He set it up, and so he's deliberately deceiving her here. Not only is he not telling her what's happening, but he's pretending that Banquo is going to be at the feast, even though he knows that he won't. And so this is outright deception, and I think this is the moment where their relationship is broken. It's where the break happens, and they don't recover from this. The point at which Macbeth chooses to lie to his wife is the point of no return for them. So Lady Macbeth says again, you must leave this. And she said things like this before lots of times, but here her tone is again full of concern rather than anger. And the modal verb must makes her anxiety really clear. You must leave this. It's almost like she's pleading with him to let it go, so that he doesn't suffer unnecessary consequences. There's an urgency to what she's saying. And what follows is really quite disturbing. It's more of that imagery, like the snake that we've seen, that reveals how really deeply troubled Macbeth is. So Macbeth, he, as we've said, uses another troubling metaphor, but he reveals the new source of his anguish. So it's not about guilt anymore. It's the insecurity that he feels and his suspicion of Banquo and Fleance. And I just want to go back to that full of scorpions line briefly. I seem to have lost my annotation of it. Think about what that says. Think about the connotations. It's almost like a horror movie. Imagine his mind, his head, his brain crawling with scorpions. It's so sinister. We've got that sense of the scorpions being poised to strike at any moment, the danger that he feels, the nervousness, but that sort of crawling fear, these doubts that won't settle, that are always present, that are creeping and crawling through his mind. It's a really distressing, disturbing image. Now, Lady Macbeth says something very telling here. She says that Fleance and Banquo are not eternal. They're not immortal. And this is the line that basically seems to confirm that she's had a similar thought to Macbeth, that actually they need to get rid of Banquo and Fleance, and that stop that last prophecy coming true. And so again, she is revealing herself to be very similar to Macbeth. They both think along the same lines. Remember that their first thoughts on hearing the prophecies, both of them, was to kill Duncan. And again, their first thoughts to deal with the issue of Banquo and Fleance is to kill them. And Macbeth says, he hints at the plan to kill Banquo. He says, yes, it's comforting to know that they're assailable, they can be murdered, they can be killed. And he says that there's going to be a terrible deed done before nightfall tonight. And so he hints at it, but doesn't say it outright. And Lady Macbeth obviously is really intrigued. She says, what's to be done? But he won't tell her. He believes she's going to be impressed, but because he knows the way she thinks, but he won't tell her. He keeps her in the dark, and he claims that it's so that she's innocent of the deed. She's guilty of one murder, but she's not going to be guilty of any others. Now, perhaps he is trying to protect her, or perhaps he just wants to shut down the conversation because he doesn't want to let her in. Look at Macbeth's language through this section. We've looked at a semantic field before, but again, look at the semantic field here. Look how much time he spends describing darkness. It's quite disturbingly poetic, full of imagery and detail and sensory detail. He presents night as strong and crafty. So we've got bloody and invisible hand, tear to pieces, night's black agents and prey. So night is like the predator, and day is presented as quite weak and feeble. So we've got tender eye, pitiful day. We've got all of that sort of stuff, and we've got daylight being described as prey. And so the semantic field here is all about destruction and chaos. And if you look at his language, the quality of his language, it's very poetic, but it's almost like he's in a trance. And in a previous slide, let me see if I can find it quickly. Here we go. We've got him describing restless ecstasy here. And perhaps this is an example of that restless ecstasy. It's almost trance-like, but it's full of quite disturbing, chaotic, troubling images. So perhaps that's Shakespeare showing us really the state of mind Macbeth is in at this point. What's also worth noting is the awkwardness of the language here. It sounds very poetic, it sounds very fluent, but actually if we look more closely, there's quite a lot of awkwardness going on here. It's in iambic pentameter, so that's the 10 syllables per line, and most of it is blank verse, so there's no rhyme, but occasionally some rhyme creeps in. So the iambic pentameter shows that in some respects, Macbeth is totally in control. He's totally stable and secure, and there's still that element of nobility about him. But when we look at the rhyme, it's actually bizarre. The rhyme is all over the place. So we've got opposites, we've got night and day here, so it doesn't rhyme, the sounds don't rhyme, but there's a link between those two lines. They're opposites of each other. Now again, we've got consonants, so we've got a different thing going on here. So consonants is almost like half rhyme, where the consonant sounds match but the vowel sounds don't. So we've got hand and bond. So we've got the ND at the end of this word in both words. So that's our matching consonant sound. But the vowel, the A and the O, don't match. And so it's not quite rhyme. Hand and band would be full rhyme, but we've got something different going on here. So that's quite jarring as well. And then we've got rhyming couplets. So we've got all sorts of things going on in this last section. We've got rhyming couplets as well. And so the rhyme, in contrast to the iambic pentameter, shows a lack of control. So we've got control and lack of control, or loss of control, both happening in in this section. And again, we could add to that, we've got enjambment as well. So these thoughts are tumbling out of him, and the phrases don't always end at the ends of lines. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so we've got all sorts of things going on here to show how Macbeth is becoming increasingly unstable. So this is a really good section. If you get a question on how the language works to show Macbeth's state of mind, this is a really good section to reference, because there's all sorts of things going on with the language here that reveal that. So the rhyming couplet at the end of the scene is really important, and it's part of the reason for that couplet is to draw our attention to it, like Lady Macbeth's couplet at the beginning of the scene. There's a sort of symmetry to this scene that is quite disturbing, but also shows that we're on that pivot point, that balance where it's just going to tip over the other way. And so what we've got here is a couplet that foreshadows everything that's going to come in the rest of the play. This is another way that Shakespeare makes this the pivotal scene. So he has Macbeth saying that Lady Macbeth marvels at his words. That means that she's amazed, impressed, confused all at once. But hold thee still, he says to her. But be still, just you wait. Things bad begun make strong themselves by ill. So this is Macbeth telling us that the only way he's going to make his reign secure is by doing more bad things. And it points towards all of the murders and deaths and all of the harsh rule that is going to come in the remainder of the play. So that's the end of the scene. Off they go to get ready for the feast. So what's important in this scene? I'm just going to move myself to the top. First of all, what's important is that both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are unhappy with their position as king and queen, but they say it to themselves rather than each other. So both of them have revealed this in soliloquy in the previous scene and in this scene, but they don't confide in each other. Both of them believe that they would be better off being the victim rather than the murderer. They both believe they'd be better off dead. Again, they both feel the same things, but they don't know it. Macbeth confesses to being in torment, and actually, implicitly, Lady Macbeth has done the same thing. You don't wish for death. You don't wish that you were dead if you are in a good emotional place. And so the fact that they're both thinking they'd be better off dead shows just the depths to which they've sunk. They're both in torment and turmoil. He's made plans without her. This is really important. Not only has he made plans without her, but he refuses to let her into the plan, even when she asks. And actually, he deliberately deceives her in this scene. Now, she doesn't persuade or get angry, so her personality seems to have gone through something of a transformation, and we're left asking what has happened to that inner strength that we saw all the way through the early parts of the play. He encourages her to be false. So this is a reversal of Act 1, Scene 5. So this is them almost exchanging roles. She's the one that doesn't really know what to do and is full of doubt, but he's the one encouraging duplicity and falseness. And the scene sets up the complete destruction of their relationship. It's that turning point that they're not going to come back from. Right, so what do I want you to do with all of this? If you did the task in the last tutorial, you will have done a complete practice essay. So I've made it a little bit lighter this week. So what I want you to do is complete the scene frame on Act 3, Scene 2 as thoroughly as you can. And so that will be sent out to you. I'll also put it on a next slide so that you've got it to look at if you're watching this on YouTube. So complete that as thoroughly as you can. And remember, you need to include methods and quotes to make revision easier. So what you should have once you've done that scene frame is a single page revision guide for that scene, so that if an extract comes up from that scene, you know all of the methods and quotes that you can refer to in your discussion of what's going on. Okay, so that's the end of this tutorial. I'll see you again next week for Act 3, Scene 3, The Murder of Banquo. Hope that's been helpful, and I'll see you next week. Bye.